Welcome everybody. Happy Friday. Watching the numbers here and my distance vision isn't great, but I think I can see the numbers ticking up and everybody joining us. So welcome. We are so excited to be back for the resumption of our Hendry at Home virtual tasting series. We're very excited today to be kicking it off with none other than George Hendry. So we've missed you guys and we're really excited to be back. For those of you who maybe this is the first time you're joining us, I just want to go over, as we always do, a little bit of the technology. We're using a Zoom webinar here, so you can see and hear us, but we can't see and hear you. So we've opened up a chat box and a Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. The chat, if you want to chat with everybody, which I will say is a lot of fun, make sure to change who you're chatting to. At the very bottom, there's a drop-down box, and if you open that, you can change it to all panelists and attendees. If you leave it set to all panelists, it'll go straight to the wonderful, great Angela Douglas, who's sitting here with us. And she would love to hear from you, but if you want to chat with everybody, make sure you change that. You can also submit questions through either the chat or the Q&A function. We hope that you will send us your questions about this year's harvest and what the 2020 vintage has been like. Also, if you've been with us before, you'll know that we tend to get into the wines a little bit later in the hour, but you should not wait for us. We hope that you'll dive in. We've got here the 2018 Unoaked Chardonnay, the 2015 Cabernet, and then we'll talk at the very end, but we've thrown in a little bonus wine that we're going to taste with you, the 2016 Cabernet. So please, you guys should get started. We would definitely recommend if you have at home 2 glasses, they're pretty different wines. And if you have a little something to nibble on with that Cabernet, we'll talk about the pairings in a moment, but that, some cheese or some almonds or something with a little bit of fat really helps that cab taste even better than it is. So without further ado, we'll jump into it. So our topic today is harvest in the 2020 vintage. We did talk earlier in the summer about harvest writ large, what the harvest process is like here at Hendry. Of course, every year is a little different. And I would say, even to the casual observer, 2020 has been a very different year, of course, in many ways. But compared to 2018 and 2019, it's been rather unusual. So we thought we would break it down and talk about some different components of the year. And we thought we would start with just the elephant in the room, which is the smoke that's been here in the valley. We've had a lot of fires the last couple of months. So we thought we would just jump right in and address that, as well as talking a little bit about just what overall this year has been like. So I'll turn it over to George for a little summary here.
Well, we're not immune from fire, but very fortunately, the major fires in Napa have been much further north at the upper end of the valley, and we had no fires close to us.
Knock wood.
And the wines that we have made so far have exhibited, through tasting, no evidence of smoke taint. This is a big subject. We can get into that a little bit further, but we feel fairly fortunate that we've been able to dodge the bullet on the smoke taint issue. The whole area of smoke taint is very complex, and I don't think that anybody really fully understands it. The folks that are best at it seem to be down in Australia, where they've been dealing with this problem now for many years. And we've sent samples down there to have them look at them and get their opinion, but it's a long turnaround. The wines we've made have all been, we've just finished today. Our last fermentation has now gone completely dry, which means it can be tasted very accurately. And of all the lots of wine we made, we have not detected, from a sensory point of view, smoke taint in any of them. That doesn't mean it's not there. It can hide and be released later. And that's something that the Australians are much into, but the news so far is good. This is not true. When you get into the upper part of the valley, above Yountville, there's been a great deal of problems with wines that come out of fermentation, definitely tasting smoky. So far, we've dodged the bullet.
And it's something you'll continue to look at and evaluate, right, as we get those test
Well,
results back.
as we go further into it and more testing, we'll know more about what's going on, but we feel cautiously optimistic at this point about having escaped the smoke taint issue. There is an interesting factor. What the Australians have pointed out is that smoke taint seems to be worse when you're close to a fire. Secondhand smoke that's more than about a day old, doesn't seem to get metabolized and move into the plant's biological system and get incorporated into the fruit. And there's a number of research papers talking about the vintage around Canberra in Australia, where they did get a lot of secondhand smoke, but no smoke taint. And that seems to be pretty much our situation here. We got quite a bit of secondhand smoke, but nothing really fresh. So we're also on that score, we're also feeling cautiously optimistic.
That's a good phrase for the whole year, really, cautiously optimistic. So I think that's definitely the question we're getting from a lot of people. You know, it's made headlines, the fires here. So that's a big issue. But stepping back a little bit, there have also been some things that marked 2020 is pretty different from 2018 and 2019. And if we go all the way back to the beginning of the growing season, this year we had far less rain than the prior 2 years. Is that right?
Well, we had much less rain this year than last year, although we did get a fairly cool, wet weather during bloom in May. And that reduced the yield, particularly in the Chard and Pinot. And overall, we picked about 350 tons in the vineyard last year, and our tonnage this year is about 270. So it's a very, very significant drop in total production from the vineyard.
Would you say that's a bad thing or a good thing, or neither?
It's a double-edged sword. You obviously don't have as much wine to sell, but often the plants have less mouths to feed and berries on the vines, so every berry gets more, so you tend to get maybe a little nicer, more concentrated wine out of the grapes.
One thing I've learned from you, George, is that the timing of these particular events, things like when we get rain, when heat spells happen, the timing is almost more important than, say, the total amount of rain or the overall temperatures that summer, because as you pointed out, it was during bloom that we had that sort of cold, rainy weather this year, and that is an important time for the plant. So it's interesting to me that even though we think of this year as being so much drier than prior years, the rain that we did have kind of had an impact for those particular varietals.
Well, it has an impact overall, because the plant will also become less productive next year.
Oh.
The little buds that are actually going to give us fruit or leaves or tendrils next year are differentiating this year. And if they see lots of sun, they tend to give you more grapes. But if those little primordial buds are not getting the sun, they tend to give you more leaves and tendrils. So you have an effect this year which will carry over into next year. But that's just goes with the territory in our business. You have to deal with that.
Sure. And were there aspects, so if this year what happened is going to impact the 2020 crop, were there things that happened in 2019 that you saw play out this year?
Absolutely. And we also in 2019 did have a relatively cool, damp weather when the Chardonnay and Pinot were basically forming buds.
So same timing.
So I think we saw that also. We also had a little frost event this year, which also was definitely not a positive.
And that was the frost concentrated in those same varieties, the
Well,
Chardonnay.
they're fairly early, so that late frosts tend to catch them.
Gotcha. But our other varieties, things like the Zinfandel, the Cabernet, those weren't going through bud break at that time. And
That's
so
correct.
they were unaffected.
So, but even in those varieties, we saw lower yields this year.
Okay.
Overall, we're sort of around 2/3 of what we picked last year.
Okay. And by Napa standards, though, I mean, 250, 270 tons. We've got 114 acres. That's just about a little over 2 tons per acre. It's fairly conservative.
Our vineyard is a very low producing vineyard normally. And 3 tons per acre is a very, very high yield for us. Some vineyards, actually, when you get up into the center of the valley, they're producing 7, 8, even 10 tons per acre. And we just can't do that on our kind of ground.
Yeah. So
our business tends to be more producing concentrated wines that take advantage of our particular growing conditions here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things I've learned over many years of doing business. You learn what your vineyard will do, and you pay a lot of attention to helping it do that.
Yep. So we had, and I know that you know this, what was how much rain did we get overall this year?
The overall rainfall for the vineyard was just around 30 inches, a little less.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a little less rain than 2018 and 2019, and then we had a bit of a frost spell that impacted the Chardonnay and Pinot. And then it seems to me personally, maybe it's just my own comfort levels. I felt that I thought I was hot all summer. It seemed like a very toasty year overall. Was it hotter this year than other years?
We only had a couple of periods before harvest. We had only one period of 4 days that we had temperatures in the 100-degree range. So it was pretty modest temperatures through the summer. We did get into picking into the middle of harvest. We got a week of 100-degree weather.
I remember that. Yeah, it was unpleasant.
And that certainly gives the vines something to think about.
Yeah.
But we've seen that before. That's happened. Remember even back in the 80s, I had a period like that. And we just left the fruit on the vines, and then when it cooled down, they rehydrated. And the fruit came back into balance, and we picked it and made some pretty decent wine.
So it didn't cause you to rush out and pick. You weren't worried about the heat bringing up the sugar levels and trying to get that fruit in before it got too high?
Well, we can control that.
How does that work?
Well, the vine with the vine, when it cools down and doesn't have the big water demand, begins to get enough water from the soil so that it will actually rehydrate the grapes. And you can actually watch the sugar levels in the grapes come down, and you can watch the acid levels come back up. And I've actually done that, made those measurements several years when we've had hot spells. And so quite often the best thing to do is when you get a hot spell is just to go through it and then let the plant recover.
Ride it out. Interesting. And so you made a distinction that during a lot of the growing season, it wasn't particularly hot for the grapes, just us humans who are wimps, I guess. But during harvest is when we really felt the heat. You mentioned that the plant was able to adjust. Are there things that throughout the growing season that the plant does in order to protect itself?
Well, there are probably lots of things, and that we're a long way from understanding all the the general biology of plants. You know, we know the growth features, but the biochemistry of plants is way complicated. And if people have spent a lot less time and money on it than they have on the biochemistry of people.
Mm. Interesting. And so, of course, we were out there, you know, our crew was out picking during this heat and during the smoke. And so we adjusted our some of our actions a little bit to account for that, right?
Well, certainly with the heat, we decided it would be best for the grapes and for our pickers to pick early. So we normally started at 4 in the morning working with lights. And so we'd be finished before noon.
Yeah.
So we didn't have people out there in the field in the heat of the afternoon. And we'd get the fruit back to the winery early. We get it processed, get it chilled down, and it all worked. It all seemed to work pretty well. The other thing we did was that when we started seeing dense smoke coming in from these fires, well, I really got my nose rubbed in, and I actually made a mistake and left the back door of my house open accidentally. And I have a white Corian countertop. And I came back about 6 o'clock, 6:30 at night from the winery, and that thing was just gray with ash. And, you know, I said to myself right there, I don't want that in my fermenters. So what we did is we actually went out and we hired a lot of extra people, and we went through the vineyard and we took the leaves out of the vines, out of the fruit zone. And then Mike Hendry went through with his spray rig and we washed all of the vines right away with a lot of water. So we tried to get the things off the plants that could possibly be absorbed or basically get metabolized into smoke taint. And then we did one other thing. I remember it was a Saturday that happened. On Sunday, Jeff and I built a modification for our sorting table where we have a washing station, and all the grapes that came in got washed before they went into the fermenter, washed and dried.
Quite an operation.
It was actually quite a little tour de force, but we worked some long hours, and by Monday morning that thing was up and working, so that after we started getting smoke here, everything got washed in the vineyard and washed a second time before it went into the fermenters. Now, I don't know enough about the biology of how these compounds are absorbed and metabolized in the plant, but I do know that if you don't have those compounds there, they don't get metabolized. And if you get it happen quick enough, so you get them off. And we certainly did our best. We did everything we possibly could to minimize the impact of smoke taint.
Yeah, it was a lot of work. And I think there are some fun photos on our Facebook and Instagram pages. And you can see in one of them, you know, Jeff up there on the sorting table, raking out the grapes. And you can see behind him the fans that were set up to be the drying function of this washing station. So it was nothing like that. We never had to do anything like that before, right, George?
Never had to do anything like that before, but I felt a lot better
having done it.
Having done it.
Absolutely.
Now, whether it did any good or not, that's a whole other issue. But at least we haven't seen anything in the wine.
Yep.
That we can taste.
Are there, right. And that is something that you're doing on a daily basis, right? Tasting all the wines right now.
That's right.
So yes, this year
it's not just, I'm not the only one doing the tasting. I have a tasting panel, and two of my oldest friends, Genevieve Janssens, who is retired now as the director of winemaking for Robert Mondavi's operation of that, all of their wineries, and Rich Arnold, who has been with that organization all his career, and makes that world famous, made that world famous Mondavi Reserve Chardonnay. And both of those people taste with me regularly. And so I'm not the Lone Ranger out there doing all this tasting.
Some very experienced palates, making sure that what we have going out there is
It's
gonna be
actually
top-notch.
great tasting with these people that are really good, because you get perspectives and insights that you wouldn't get just doing this all by yourself.
Yeah.
I never taste with those people that I don't come away enriched by those additions.
That's great. That's great. So 2020, it's been quite a year, really different in a lot of ways. Are there any things any parts of the year or any components of the vintage that sort of stand out to you or give you any food for thought heading into 2021?
Well, the wines are actually tasting quite good. The Pinot Noirs that we now have been in barrel for at least a month and are mostly completed. The second fermentation, the malolactic fermentation, are looking quite good. And I think we have several lots of different clones of Pinot, and it's going to be a lot of fun seeing how we're going to put those together into our reserve Pinot. We got a lot to work with, and the same is true of the Chardonnay. We have 4 different lots of Chardonnay, and we're using a very advanced technique, actually Rich Arnold's technique, in managing the wine. And it's a technique which involves using all new barrels, which means you don't do that unless you think you've got a lot in the wine to cover all that new oak. And this has been a very, very interesting little experience for me. And what I'm seeing so far, I really, really like.
That's good. And we had previewed for our club members who have joined us. If you were with us about 3 weeks ago, we did a club member dinner with George, and he previewed a little bit of that work that he's been doing with Rich and Genevieve around a reserve Chardonnay, reserve Pinot as well.
That's more of an issue. I've got to sort of wait and see what the vineyard is going to give us.
Okay. But that'll be kind of fun to look forward to in a couple of years here when those get released. One
of the issues with the Pinot Noir is that a lot of the vineyard is quite young, and it's sort of getting its footing. And so I'm like the wines, but I really want to see how they develop and what's really happening.
All right. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about sort of how we make the decisions about picking and the concept of ripeness. As I said before, there is a Q&A function. If you guys have any questions about this particular harvest, we've saved time at the end, so Angela will shoot those questions over to us. So please don't hesitate to. We would love to know what questions you all have. We've tried to anticipate some, but let us know. But why don't we talk a little bit about ripeness? You know, I think at the most basic level, I think a lot of people know we measure the sugar levels before we pick the grapes. We look at the acid. You talked about those two features and how they play together. You know, usually sugars are going up and acids are coming down. But there are other features that you in particular are really paying attention to through tasting and everything.
Well, let's be blunt. You can go to the store and you can buy alcohol. And you can go to the store and you can buy tartaric acid. And so these are things that, yes, the grapes produce them. It's very important that they be in the right balance, but they're not they're not the main things that we're tasting in great wine. Mm-hmm. And those things actually have to be synthesized in the grapes and developed basically in the skins and the seeds both.
And those are called?
Well, there are various things. You have basically phenols, which are generated in both seeds and skins. And then you also have sugars. And the sugars start out being simple sugar, the stuff like we put in our coffee. But then they tend to join together with some of these complex phenols into things called glycosides. And those are the things that actually end up the things that we associate with flavor. That's why a Pinot doesn't taste like a Zinfandel. You have different glycoside functions and different sets of these things. And it's very complex. I don't think that it's some of these things where people haven't even learned to analyze hardly, let alone understand them well. But they're terribly important. And so one of the things we do in picking is we don't worry so much about sugar. What we worry about more is the phenol development. And a good indicator of that in making red wine are the seeds. In making white wine, we don't use seeds. They're just not part of the recipe. But in making red wine, the wine is in the fermenter with the seeds and skins. And if you have a green seed, you have very different types of phenols extracted than you would in a brown seed. So one thing you look at is just the color. And if you want to be really fussy, you put the seed in your back teeth and break it. And then you sort of see what those phenols that are now liberated do to you. And if they haven't been on the vine long enough, you get an intense burning bitter on the side of your tongue. So those are all things that we think about and we walk through the vineyard and we taste. Actually, here before harvest, we're walking that vineyard every couple of days, trying to see how these flavors, how these phenols are developing and how the flavor is developing in the grapes. And it's pretty dramatic. Now, quite often, when we get the balances that we want between these phenols and the flavor compounds, the grapes will have very intense flavor, but we'll find out that we've got way high sugars. And that we've adopted an old French trick, which goes back many years. We actually remove sugar before we ferment. So we don't focus on sugar because it's quite controllable.
It's easier to adjust that.
Yeah,
so
it's easy. It's fairly easy to remove it from the fermenter, and we do.
Yep. And how do we do that?
Well, the juice of the grapes basically has very little in it. It's the seeds and skins basically have the things that make serious red wine. And so before we extract anything, as we go into a tank, we'll actually drain part of the juice out. And we turn it into, it actually ends up being rosé, but it's so light that it wouldn't even make a very interesting rosé. So then what we do is we take a little bit of a very low tannin red, like Primitivo. In fact, that's the one I always use. And 2 or 3% addition of that will then take that almost nothing wine and turn it into a very pleasant rosé.
So we're using the stuff that we drain off from the red wine.
We call that process, we use the French word for bleeding. It's called saignage or saignage. And so then what you do is you remove sugar from the tank that way because that sugar is in the juice. Mm-hmm. And then what you do is you replace that with water. And the water essentially does not have any sugar, but you have not increased the volume of the tank. So when you extract color and flavor from skins and phenol from seeds, it's going back, it ends up in the same volume you started with. And so you end up with reducing the sugar, but without reducing the concentration of the wine. It's a very neat trick. And one of the things that Genevieve taught me about 20 years ago.
So you're really focused then on the phenolic development in the grape and the sugars are maybe of secondary importance. You know how to adjust for that. What about acid? Is that something that can be adjusted quite as easily?
With whites, the acid is pretty critical.
Okay.
Because adjusting acid is very tricky business, and I'd rather not do it. So what we're really doing is, since we don't pay much attention to seeds with whites, because the seeds don't contribute anything.
Right. They're not sitting in the tank with
They're not sitting in the
juice,
tank.
right?
They're basically removed in that whole cluster pressing operation. But so what we really worry about there is we pick those grapes, we pay a lot of attention to the acid levels.
Mm-hmm.
And that tends to be a more important thing than with the reds.
So you're keeping a closer eye on that as things are coming right.
But also just the taste. The taste of the grapes is very important also.
Yeah.
And that's why walking the vineyard regularly and every couple of days before a harvest. It's quite amazing what can happen in just a couple of days.
Yeah.
On the vine.
Yeah. And we picked these particular wines that we're tasting today, the unoaked Chardonnay and the Cabernet. Our first thought was, it would be sort of fun to try the two wines that are the bookends to our harvest. So day one often involves picking some Chardonnay, and Cab is usually the last, if not one of the last things that comes in. But as we were preparing for this, George, we were talking about phenols and how that impacts the feel of wine in your mouth. And you pointed out that, we don't think of it perhaps in the same way as we do with the Cabernet, but this Chardonnay does have some good phenols, right?
Absolutely. And both from the grapes and from the barrels, when you have a barrel fermented Chardonnay.
If you put it into oak, sure.
So if you were to taste this against a very, very light wine like the Pinot Gris, you'll find out that there's more mouthfeel.
Mm-hmm. And the phenols are what contribute to mouthfeel.
What?
And the phenols are what contribute to mouthfeel.
The phenols actually then turned into more complex forms that basically give you mouthfeel. And the phenols combined with fruit, giving you things called glycosides, and good Lord, there's a huge zoo of them, and we don't understand them all. Yeah. But they're very important, and that's what gives the wine its texture and its mouthfeel and its richness.
Mm-hmm. Well, then we thought this ends up being a great comparison then, because we've got two pretty different wines here. So we're going to dive in and taste here. Taste, and it's 5 o'clock here, so do a little drinking too. We hope you are enjoying these as well. And we thought we would share some of our observations. I thought it might be really nice, George, to hear how you approach evaluating and tasting a wine. I think it's probably different than the way a lot of the rest of us do it. What do you look for?
Well, it all depends on your individual palate. First off, there are no two people that taste the same way. Everybody has a very unique tasting system, just the way you have unique features and eye color and talents. You don't taste the same way as your neighbor. When I do a lot of tasting with other people, and particularly my consultants, and I know how Rich tastes, I know how Genevieve tastes, and they don't taste the way I do. And sometimes we don't even reach the same conclusions because our palates are structured differently. I know that. Mm-hmm. So you have to factor all that in. But let's take a look at the
Chardonnay. Cheers.
Notice in tasting, it doesn't just taste like water in your mouth. There's something that almost sticks to your palate, and those are the complex phenols, the glycosides. They actually are telling me I've got something in my mouth other than just a drink of water. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I pay a lot of attention to in wine. And when you've got a good vineyard that is a low yielding vineyard with high quality grapes, you tend to develop a lot of those characters in the wine. If you the more wine you produce per acre, the very high yielding vineyards, that you don't get that. You get less of that mouthfeel. So that's one of the first things I pay attention to. The other thing, of course, is the flavor. It tastes like Chardonnay. It happens to be Chardonnay.
That's a good.
Just like an apple tastes like an apple and a pear tastes like a pear, well, it tastes like Chardonnay.
If it didn't, we'd probably have a problem on our hands. So that's a good place to start, right?
Well, you can have winemaking defects and the vineyard defects, which will modify that.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you have a problem in fermentation, let's say you have a fermentation doesn't work very well, the yeast are struggling, they'll often do a thing they get very antisocial. They'll do things like throw off hydrogen sulfide, which is nasty stuff. You might remember that from Chem Lab, the nasty smelling stuff you had to use to do your little analyses. Well, that is bad enough in itself, but it's a very, very reactive species, and it will react with other things to go on to form very, very complex molecules that are called mercaptans, and those destroy the flavor of the wine because they will dominate. You're going to hijack your palates, so all you taste is the mercaptan. There's one very common one that you run into is dimethylphenol. It's actually it actually tastes like creamed corn. And if you find a wine that tastes like sort of this canned creamed corn, it's got that stuff. And that's actually can be fairly decent. They can go on to make some very nasty things. And so one of the things we worry a lot about in winemaking is keeping the wine clean. And Jan Miller, who is basically responsible for that Chardonnay, does a really good job of that. She's watching the fermentations as they go on. She's looking at those little samples and looks at them under the microscope to be sure that she doesn't have any antisocial bacteria getting a foothold there. And we take the action we need to control that if we have to.
Yeah.
So it's constant vigilance is very important in making a wine like this, where you have the flavor comes through and it's well framed on your palate, and you can actually taste it.
Yeah. Well, and that's a nice little almost plug, George. Next week we're gonna have Jan join us and talk a little bit more in detail about fermentation and sort of the early stages of winemaking, what happens once we get the fruit into the winery, maybe do a couple experiments here. But she'll tell us a little bit more about those things that keep her up at night, and things that she's hoping to avoid in the winery. So yes, well, it's good that this, I agree, it does taste like Chardonnay. It tastes like really good Chardonnay. So hopefully you're all enjoying it as well.
The other thing I watch when I'm tasting is very carefully. Once you sort of reach the end, how long does it continue on your back palate? Quite frankly, when you're winemaking, you're not drinking this stuff. Sort of the standard taste is you get it into your mouth, you sort of see what kind of texture is it really coating my mouth, and are the flavors about right. You suck a little air through it, and that's very important so that you get a little bit of the vapor goes into the back of your nose and then returns to your olfactory bulb, so you get the flavor that way. In fact, there's actually a very interesting little thing that you can do at home is take a sip of the wine. Breathe in, you taste nothing. Breathe out.
Close your mouth and breathe
The
out.
flavor's there. You can do the same thing with an apple. Just take an apple, chew it, breathe in. You don't taste anything because you're not getting anything to the olfactory part of the wine has been factored out, and your brain just simply says, whoa, something's wrong here. It doesn't send it on through for processing. It's very interesting, and it's quite dramatic.
Yeah.
So you only really get the flavor when you get the aroma component of the wine to your olfactory system.
Right. Well, I mean, if you think about how we taste, we can taste sour, sweet, salty, bitter. We don't.
Those you don't need a nose for.
We don't need a nose for, but things like apples and pear and citrus, all of those are really things that we
you need
smell.
Your nose. And so I'm basically, when I'm tasting, I pour a little wine in the front of my mouth and suck some air through it. So I basically get some in the back, and then you spit, and then you breathe out, and now you get presented right away. Your brain gets this taste sensation, and then I actually wait and sort of see if I build in the back of my mouth, if I get any sense of feel. And when you get bigger, more tannic wines, it'll go on and you'll actually feeling a little tightness in the back of your throat for sometimes 2 or 3 times. And a big wine like a Cabernet, they'll go on for 20 seconds, even 30 seconds. And this one won't. It doesn't have enough tannin to do that. And you wouldn't want that much tannin here.
Right.
But these are things, mouthfeel, what it does in your mouth and what it does on the finish, and essentially the flavors which you get as you return part of the aroma through the retronasal passage to your olfactory bulb are really important. And so all those flavors, we talk about them differently, and we don't all use the same language talking about them. It's very personal.
Yeah.
It's a very, very personal operation.
Well, speaking of big tannic wines, let's shift gears and taste this 2015. I'm hoping everybody at home is breathing out and maybe setting a timer here and seeing how long this sticks in the back of your throat, because I think you've given us some good ideas for different ways to evaluate and think about the wine here, George. So this is the 2015 Cabernet, our current release.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a sample of this.
It's a big vintage. We had fairly powerful tannins, and in tasting, you can go through the little tasting drill that I basically mentioned. If you get it in your mouth, you can feel that something's happening there. It actually, you have a richness. It's something very different from water in your mouth, and you can feel the wine actually tactily moving through your palate and coating it. So there's something happening there, and it'll depend a bit on your palate. Some people that are very sensitive to tannins will can get a cottony taste. That's because your salivary glands are basically turning off and you're losing saliva. It doesn't happen to me because I'm just not sensitive to tannin.
It does happen to me, and I think we hear that from people who say, oh, this is very dry, and we always like to point out that with wine, dry has a different definition relating to how much sugar is left in the wine. But yeah, for some people, if you're tannin sensitive, it feels
the residual sugar, and that is something which basically will kill your ability to taste, because the sugar is so strong that it actually gets in the way of tasting real fruit. And your palate basically responds, so it shuts down and tastes the sugar, but you don't get the nuances.
Right.
That's one of the reasons we make a big point of keeping our wines dry.
Very dry, right. Which, again, there are different levels of tannin among all of those different wines. But
this one is one of the higher levels of tannin. And it's a wine that my palate happens to be very tannin tolerant. So it's the kind of wine that I enjoy quite a bit. Not by itself, but with fairly rich food, because the fat will actually absorb the tannin.
Right, which is why we had suggested a little fatty cheese, or we have Marcona almonds here in the tasting room that are tasty with this. We're going to talk in a minute about what we like to eat with these wines, but we would love to hear what you like to eat as well. So perhaps if you guys want to drop into the chat some of your favorite food pairings, or cheese pairings, something like that with these two wines, we'd love to hear them and we can share them with the group. What are your thoughts on this one, George?
Well, yeah, I'm still tasting. It's still on my back palate. I've got a little tightening on my back palate, maybe 2 or 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
It's way up there, but they're not, for my palate, it's actually rather soft, velvety kind of feel, not a dry, rough, harsh, stringent feel.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, typically this is the kind of wine I have when I do a rich cut of beef, like a good prime ribeye or a porterhouse or a filet mignon. When I get into really rich, fatter food, this wine is pretty ideal for that.
Yeah. We've got lots of ideas. We've got a Pinterest page with different pairing ideas. Tamara always rustles up some pretty delicious recipe ideas to pair with these. So yeah, to me, this is my go-to steak wine.
But really it's a wine which is designed for kind of food that you shouldn't eat too much of.
That's true. So I guess we should all be limiting our cab consumption somewhat, is what you're saying. So we've also, as I said, we've poured a little bonus wine here. So I know we have a lot of club members on today. Your club shipments are being prepared and will go out later this month. And in it, you will have some of the 2016 Cabernet. So we thought we would do a little preview. We know that every time we switch vintages, people always want to ask and want to know how it compared to the one they just had. They're familiar, in this case, with the 2015. How does the 2016 stack up?
The 2016, by comparison to the 2015, is a little bit, doesn't have quite as much mouthfeel. It's It's got a gentle palate, but not quite as heavy as the 15. And for people that tend to be a little more sensitive to tannins and astringency in wine, you'll probably like it more because it doesn't require as much. Well, if you've got a sensitive palate, it's gentler on the palate. The fruit levels are higher right now because it's a year younger. They're both of them all brand new French barrels, but the barrels are nicely hidden in the fruit. They're just an integral part of the wine. They don't stand out as oak.
The oak
But
doesn't
there's
dominate.
there's a lot. It's all brand new barrels. So the barrels are pretty expensive too. They're about $1,000 each.
So we're not skimping on this cab. So they're made, I think, in a nearly identical style, right? They both
Well, they're
of these
made
vintages.
in the same basic style, but you have 2 different years.
Sure, right.
And so we got less extraction of total phenols in 2016.
And why was that?
Well, I don't understand the plant physiology well enough to tell you that. I mean, I'm sure the plants have very good reasons for what they do. The farming was the same, and the things we do in the vineyard were the same, but the year turned out to produce lighter structured wines in general, which for those of you that like lighter structured wines, it's real cool. For those of us that like heavier wines, we would probably go for the 2015 vintage.
All right. Well, Angela would probably be happy. We would I'd be remiss if I didn't say we've got plenty of both. So depending on your preference and your taste, we can satisfy that. So
one of the reasons we make so many different wines is we actually
right.
try to cover a lot of bases and different palates and things that'll work for different people in different situations.
Yeah. Would you pair this with similar food, or might you sort of pick a less fatty, less rich meal to have with it?
I mean, I'm sort of fantasizing right now what the 2016 would taste like with a nice lamb chop that I do with some a little chopped up the rosemary and garlic and olive oil, and
that does sound good.
I think that could actually work quite well. It's not so heavy that it would kill that lamb chop. It might be quite nice.
All right. I think you've got a plan for dinner this weekend, George. All right. So we've got just under 10 minutes here. I know we have some questions, so we're going to go to those here. Let's see. Okay, we've got lots here. All right. So let's double back here to the unoaked Chardonnay. This is from Julie Snyder, who has been in our club since day one, 2004. She asks, are the unoaked and barrel fermented Chardonnays from the same block, or are they usually different year to year?
They're usually different year to year.
Okay.
And we will pick the grapes for the unoaked Chardonnay that tend to fit with this style. And for the barrel fermented, we tend to select grapes that work with our barrel fermented style. And we do that year by year based on the individual wine and what we really want the end product to be.
All right. And we'll taste the barrel fermented next week when we have Jan in to talk about fermentations, because that has a slightly different approach or process that we use. So stay tuned for that, Julie. Guy Lenardi here has a question about biodynamics. So he asks, do you subscribe to the notion that the sap concentration up from the roots is affected by the time of day, moon position, etc., or is that not a factor?
Well, I'm sure that all of those things are very important to the plant, but exactly how they work, and when you get down to finally the molecular level of the individual molecular systems that are actually producing the phenols and glycosides and sugars that end up in the grapes, we don't know.
All right.
It's very, very complicated. And then people tend to, which is very annoying to me, people tend to come up with they oversimplify this, or they try to turn it into touchy-feely concepts, which are pretty non-useful to people that are trying to grow grapes and make wine.
Interesting. You may have touched on this a little bit in just now when you talked about how you select the grapes for the unoaked Chardonnay versus the barrel fermented, but Belinda Smith, also one of our original club members here, wants to know for you and for the Hendry label, what makes a wine a reserve wine? How are you thinking about putting those together, and how does it differ from what you've done so far?
Well, first off, we haven't used the term reserve.
Right.
Because there's so many reserves out there. They've turned out to be a overworked term. Now, I do want to make some corrections. There are a couple of reserves out there that I have a lot of respect for, and it's what Genevieve has done at Robert Mondavi. And they have a reserve Chardonnay and a reserve Cabernet, which are both awesome wines. But normally speaking, the term reserve has been overworked.
So you might shy away from it then for the special sort of project you've been working on with your Chardonnay.
I'm trying to do that, yes. And we've got a number of things we're thinking about, but reserve is something that I don't know how useful that is from the point of view of marketing. Well, quite frankly, you're looking at somebody who is not very good at marketing. So,
all right. So if there are any marketing gurus, geniuses on the call, please give us some ideas. So aside from what we would call it, from a winemaking perspective or a fruit selection perspective, what are sort of the principles that you're using in putting that wine together, that new Chardonnay that you're working on, and how would it be distinguished from what you've done so far?
well, I'll be quite frank. I've always loved that Robert Mondavi Reserve Chardonnay, and I like to make something in that
Style.
in that class. And so Rich Arnold is the guy that's been making this for, good Lord, 30 years. And I figured having him on our team gave us a pretty good chance. We've got a very good vineyard with some very good vineyard blocks. And Rich has brought a lot of insight into those, how we handle that wine and just some of the winemaking steps. And I think we've got some very exciting stuff in barrels right now.
And that would come out next year. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. Well, that'll be fun. We can taste through them then. So stay tuned. The last question here from Mark Johnson asks, why does my Hendry, so the one Mark is drinking, have a different label from these ones on the table? And he is drinking the 2017 HRW Cabernet Sauvignon.
The HRW is decent wine, but it's usually what's been sorted out in making the other wines. And the Hendry wines are really have a certain level of mouthfeel and intensity of flavor that you really have to be a Hendry wine. And the HRWs, certainly if you look at them in comparison to a lot of Napa Valley wines, they're quite good.
Yeah, they're great.
But they don't quite meet the standards for the wine that we would like to give the Hendry label to.
You thinking that they're typically, the fruit
They're
is a little
lighter,
younger, a little
they're
lighter.
a little bit lighter, yeah, and less definition in the fruit.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a number of things that move you out of the Hendry category to an HRW.
Yeah, I think of them as a nice option for something, a meal that's perhaps a little lighter, or perhaps
quite often somebody just wants to drink a glass of wine. They're not thinking that much about it. They just want a little pleasant glass of wine.
Yeah, and
I think the HRW is very nice for that.
Yep, good paired with like a porch and a rocker maybe. All right, well, we've come to the end here, it looks like, of our hour together. So we want to thank everybody for tuning in. As I said at the beginning, we're so excited to be doing this again, back after our summer vacation. So we are moving to a monthly format from here on out, with the exception of this harvest doubleheader, we're calling it. Next week, as I've mentioned before, Jan will join us and we're going to talk about fermentations. So that will be next Friday, the 23rd, same time, same place for us, probably the same place for you too. So 5 p.m. Pacific. If you didn't see our email, we did put a little survey out. We know that more people are back to work these days. So in the spring, we were starting this at 3 o'clock and in the afternoon Pacific time. And we know that doesn't really work for some folks now, but it does mean that we're missing some folks, over in Europe and some other friends for whom this is a little bit late. So we put out a survey asking folks just time, day preference, what would be a good time to do these. You can find that in the email that went out on Tuesday. If you can't find the email, you can always just email one of us here. Angela, you can email me, Megan at Hendry Wines. We'd love to get your thoughts so we can make this as fun and inclusive for everybody. So stay tuned. Next week we'll stick with the 5 o'clock time, but from there on out, we'll take a poll and see what works best. So in the meantime, happy Friday, happy weekend. Thank you for tuning in, and cheers. Bye, everyone.